This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Boy, the chicken hawks in D.C., like Pagliacci Schumer, who back in the day would have blanched when Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Now he's a big tough talker on Putin. And he posted this message yesterday in response to the Trump administration's approach to trying to author a armistice in Eastern Europe.
It's 3 years since the vicious bully Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And what is Donald Trump doing today? Sucking up to this vicious bully, Putin. You know what we've learned in history? You suck up to bullies, you pay the price. And America will pay the price down the road. This man has killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians. He's invaded Ukraine. And what does Donald Trump do? Suck up to him. Say, how can I help you? Because Trump, throughout his life, has had a fascination and admiration for autocrats, for brutal people, for people who lie.
Mm-hmm. Well, Trump was singing a different tone yesterday than he was on Friday, when he was rather perturbed by Zelensky and sort of poor-mouthing the idea that the U.S. and Ukraine could get a deal done on rare earth minerals, saying something very different yesterday in his press avail with Macron, who is in town.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things, and he would like to come, as I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me. I think they then have to get it approved by their council or whoever might approve it, but I'm sure that.
And then Macron did an extended sit-down with our friend Brett Baer. And Macron, you know, socialist from France.
Right.
Striking a very different tone than the socialists in America vis-a-vis Trump. Talking about his optimism about the prospect of a process to bring about peace. Need more than a ceasefire, but there's optimism.
My concern is that we have to go fast. But we need something first, a truce, which could be assessed and checked, and full-fledged negotiation.
So a ceasefire?
Yes, but be careful, because in 2014 we had a ceasefire with Russia. And I can tell you by experience, because I was in charge with Germany to follow up the ceasefire in its respect. It was violated every time by Russia. And we didn't react, all of us. And I can tell you as well by experience, because there was one meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky in history. One. It was in Paris in December 2019. And because there was a lack of credibility of our collective deterrence, in February 2022, Putin decided to invade Ukraine. So this is why I think it's feasible to have a truce at least and start negotiating for a sustainable peace. But we need something substantial for Ukraine, for the Europeans and their security, for the US and its credibility.
Security guarantees, trust but verify. You're not going to take Putin at his word, understandable. But it was interesting to hear Macron concede the point that it was a collective security failure that encouraged Putin to build on his taking of Crimea and invade Ukraine again in search of, well, at least Donbass, if not the entire country. Something else that was interesting is Macron, despite David Brooks and others suggesting that this mineral deal that's proposed by Trump between the United States and Ukraine is some sort of paying tribute to an imperial power, Macron didn't see any problem with it.
What are you willing to commit to get to that ceasefire, or whatever you want to call it, the stopping of the war?
For me, the sequence should be the following. Negotiation between U.S. and Russia and U.S. and Ukraine. And I think President Trump announced today his willingness to have short-term meeting with President Zelensky is super important. First, to have a truce. I think it could be done in the weeks to come. truth on air, sea, infrastructures. If it is not respected, it will be the best evidence of the fact that Russia is not serious. During this period of time, we negotiate on security guarantees, land and territories, and it will be the responsibility of the Ukrainian president. Reconstruction. The US will have the deal on critical minerals and rare earths and so on.
You're fine with that?
Yeah, and I think it's very important because it's one of the best ways to have the US commitment in the Ukrainian sovereignty.
And then finally, Macron, and I mean, there was more to it, but another important piece was Macron building on that sort of concession of the failed security provisions of the West vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the recognition that Western Europe needs to do more, that the security guarantees will be led by Western Europe with the United States as a backdrop. That's the construct that he's proposing.
Our fair share of the burden, it's in Europe. We are engaged. I spoke with 30 leaders, European leaders and allies. A lot of them are ready to be part of such a deal, such a security guarantees in any way. But all of them said, okay, but if we were attacked, let's imagine once again that Russia could violate this treaty. What will happen? They need this message from the US, solidarity. And I think this is very important, and this is what we worked in details today, and this is what your president very clearly announced this morning. For me, this is what we have to negotiate and finalize. If we manage to do so, with clearly the agreement of Ukraine for what its sovereignty. At the table, yeah. And with the agreement of the Europeans, as this is European security, and the agreement of the US for this solidarity and this backstop, I think we have a deal.
For more on all of this, all of these developments, we're pleased to be joined by Julius Strauss, British journalist, former bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph's Moscow office. He's also, interestingly, a wilderness guide and bear behavioralist.
Oh, wow.
He runs Wild Bear Lodge, a bear viewing lodge in British Columbia. His Substack is backtothe.substack.com. Julius Strauss, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi.
I kind of want to talk to you more about the Wild Bear Lodge, but maybe we'll get to that.
We will, yeah.
So what do you think about sort of these developments, particularly as memorialized yesterday by Macron?
I think we have to be very careful to distinguish between what Macron wants and what he's going to say in public with Donald Trump sitting next to him. Mm-hmm. The Europeans have a huge problem, which is that up until now, they've depended entirely on the U.S. for their own security. Even sort of the British Army is basically unable to operate without American support and without American cooperation. And the same goes for most European armies. There's simply a lot of military capabilities that they don't have, that they've sort of given over to the U.S. during the last 80 years, rightly or wrongly. And so all the Europeans, including the Brits, who are no longer part of the European Union, are sitting there thinking, what the hell do we do if Trump pulls the equipment out and goes home? We are all in a hell of a lot of trouble. So it's not that Macron wants the mineral deal to go ahead. He's decided which hill he's going to fight on and which hill he's not going to fight on. He was quite insistent in the press conference that, we acknowledge that Russia was the aggressor, which is something that the Trump administration seems to be hesitant on. But he gave ground on this issue of minerals. So this was a very sort of carefully crafted performance by Macron from a very, very weak position with a very sort of low set of cards. So we'll have to see how it plays out in the coming days.
And the suggestion Macron made in that interview as well is that along with the UK, that they would be open-minded to peacekeeping troops. This would all have to be sketched out, but that, again, trying to assert more, and as you say, perhaps to make it clear in the presence of Trump that we're going to do more, and we know what more is expected of us, and we're going to do more. And here I am talking about the U.S. being the backstop, and I'm talking about us providing peacekeeping troops to essentially provide some of the security guarantees to any deal that's cut.
Yes. The one thing is this: when we think of peacekeeping, there's a sort of a difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcing, and just how active these troops are and what they do if things go wrong. Realistically, the Europeans cannot provide an effective peacekeeping force. Zelensky said, it would require between 100,000 and 200,000 troops. We're talking about a 600-mile front line here. And even that would not be enough to repel a Russian incursion, or Ukrainian incursion for that matter. What we're talking about is something much, much, much less than that. And they're calling it sort of different things. They're calling it an assurance force, which sounds anything but assuring to me. The British Army at the moment can probably field something in tens of thousands of soldiers at one time. The French perhaps a little bit more. There's no way that they can do this realistically without European backing, without American backing. Now, if there's no American backing, it doesn't mean they can't deploy anybody into Ukraine. It just means that force would be much more of a sort of a light observer mission that could report back on things going wrong, which we had after 2014 in Ukraine. There was an observer mission that sort of sat there and recorded the number of times that each side violated the ceasefire. So don't think a sort of a tough force along the border holding back anybody. It's going to be something much less substantial than that. But even to do that, they really need the Americans to say, look, if you get into a lot of trouble and if your guys start getting killed, we will come and help you out. Without that, it's going to be even more difficult to deploy anybody, really.
Well, what does Vladimir Putin want?
Putin has certain war aims, and Trump has already given him some of those, has fulfilled some of those war aims. At least he's said them, even if they haven't yet been granted. One thing Putin wants is he wants control of Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to be either, completely under his forces and his politicians and so on, or at the very least he wants, what he has right now to be in Russia, the 20% of Ukraine, and the other 80% to be beholden to him. He does not want Ukraine in NATO, and he certainly doesn't want any Western troops there for any length of time. That's his sort of number one war aim. But his number two war aim is bigger than that. He wants international recognition. He wants to be back at the top seat. Russia is, I love Russia, and I lived there for years and years, and I still have lots of Russian friends, but Russia is a fading empire, and Putin is having a hard time accepting that. I'm a Brit, and perhaps we had a hard time accepting our fading empire after the Second World War. I don't know. But Putin still thinks that Russia should be a top dog in the world, and everything from its economy and its demographics point to the fact it is no longer a top dog. And then the third thing he wants explicitly is he wants all NATO troops out of Eastern Europe. That is something that Trump hasn't addressed yet, and I don't think it's going to happen. But Trump has certainly given him quite a bit of what he wants already, if that turns out to be enshrined in some kind of peace deal.
Yeah, but what are the alternatives in terms of trying to get a peace deal that you believe Putin will abide? I mean, if you don't want to, I guess, provide sort of open-ended aid to the Ukrainians that maybe they don't even want at this point. I mean, Zelensky's sort of offered middling rhetoric about the desire to fight on and try to recapture the territory that was lost.
No, absolutely. I mean, Ukraine is not in a position to recapture any territory, certainly not at the moment. But the bigger question with Russia is, I mean, an analogy I might use is that you've got an aggressive dog and you throw it a big chunk of steak. Is that going to help matters, or is it going to make matters worse? Well, the dog might take the steak and take it home and say, thank you very much. That was a nice steak. I'm going to go home now. Or it could just say, you know what? I've got that. I'm going to keep pushing for more. And most of what we see from Russia suggests they're going to keep pushing for more. they now have reoriented their entire economy towards making war. Putin has gone to his people and said, it's not about Ukraine. We are now at war with the West. So I accept that there are differences of opinion on this, but most people think that if Putin is rewarded for this Ukraine grab, then he will simply reconstitute his army, wait 3 or 4 years, and start moving into other countries. And we've seen signs of this already. So we've seen Russia do an effective sort of political takeover in Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He's pushing into Moldova. He's making trouble in Transnistria, which is another sort of small separatist area. So the notion that this is going to be contained within Ukraine, I'd like to be an optimist and say, yes, that's what's going to happen. But every sort of political sense I have tells me that that's not going to happen, that Russia is going to keep coming until it has to pay a very high price and decides that it's not worth paying that.
Well, therein lies the rub, isn't it? I mean, I can concede your point about the peril going forward, even if there is an armistice that's agreed to, because of Putin's ambitions. However, Russia paying a high price. So what does that look like, and at whose hands? And because all of these politicians in the West talking tough, like you heard from Chuck Schumer, I mean, they're not talking about imposing a high price on Putin. I mean, they want to pretend that like sanctions is a high price or funding, providing more weapons to Ukraine is a high price, but it isn't. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about a high price that beats him back, and that requires the sort of engagement that no politician in the West, very few at least, have talked about seriously.
No, absolutely. But, I mean, we have to remember that both Russia and Ukraine have a sort of an internal ticking clock here, which is how long they can afford to sustain this war. And the best estimates we have on Russia, when we look at things like materiel and we look at things like armored personnel carriers and tanks, and when we look at the state of the Russian economy, which is now beginning to seriously overheat, and inflation, is really rising very quickly, is that Russia can sustain this kind of level of warfare for another 9 months, perhaps 12 months, and that's it. The best guess for Ukraine is 3 to 6 months. So right now, if we don't touch anything, then Ukraine would probably lose this war. But with just a little more Western support, that calculus changes in Putin's head. His position becomes less safe, if you like, and he may think, you know what, if I'm offered some kind of semi-okay negotiated settlement, I'm going to take it right now because the alternatives are worse. So I think this idea that Russia is just going to run away with this one is not right. I think both sides are really beginning to run into their reserve levels.
Mm-hmm. And so, you penned this piece making a historical comparison to a potential deal here to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which, of course, was not sustained for very long by the Russians back in World War II. And so what is your then intuition if a deal is cut that is that too fast, if there's not sort of the process that Macron was talking about yesterday, that it could encourage Putin to I'm sorry, that was in World War II. It was the Nazis, but it could encourage Putin to do in 2025 what the Nazis did in 1940.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we've got lots of historical analogies here or parallels. There's 1938 in Munich. There's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I think what we've learned from history is that appeasing expansionist dictators does not solve the problem. It might push it a couple of years or a couple of months or maybe a bit longer down the line, but it's not going to get rid of the problem. And I realize that presents, once you've said that, you then have to sit down and come up with all kinds of other solutions, which are difficult. They're not easy solutions to make. So it's not just a question of saying that and then saying, oh, well, we'll obviously do this or that then. But that's the danger that I see. Putin has basically been rewarded for this war where he is the aggressor. He has killed tens of thousands of people. And, if anybody wants to see what the Russians have done in eastern Ukraine, there's a documentary film out called Intercepted, which is absolutely shocking. They have behaved extremely badly. And I say that as a Russian speaker and someone who spent a lot of time in Russia and has a lot of Russian friends. I really want to emphasize that because I don't have a problem with Russia. It's more to do with the leadership. So unfortunately, I think we're in that situation. And I think to give Putin a substantial amount of his war aims right now will encourage, he'll go back and he'll think, that kind of worked. I'm going to figure out how to move on with this project.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, again, this is a long time coming, something that Trump inherited, because this goes back to something that Macron conceded, what they didn't do leading up to the taking of Crimea, what they didn't do after the taking of Crimea. And, here we are now more than a decade later in this difficult position.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't Trump's fault by any means. I mean, there's a lot of blame to be laid at the hands of Obama back in 2014, Angela Merkel, the German leader, back in 2014. That was when Putin sort of made a preemptory grab, and he sat back and he watched what happened next. And the truth is that very, very little happened next. So he saw that, and he's like, the West are not really going to punish me for my expansionism. Then he watched the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which happened under Biden, of course. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, gosh, the West is weak as well. So not only am I going to get away with this, but really the West is pretty divided, and they're just not up to posing some serious opposition. I think I can just swallow up, and it's a huge neighboring country, Ukraine, maybe not by North American standards, but by European standards. It's a massive, rich, valuable country. And he's basically said, I'm going to try and swallow it because I think I'm going to get away with that. And one thing I'd like to add, Putin is not a risk taker. So in his analysis, this was not a big risk that he was taking on. He thought this would be easy, but he made a mistake.
Julius Strauss, British journalist, former bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph's Moscow office. Also a wilderness guide and bear behavioralist. He runs Wild Bear Lodge, a bear viewing lodge in British Columbia. His Substack, backtotherefront.substack.com. Julius Strauss, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
We'll get to the Bears next time. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.
We'll talk property taxes and all things Illinois policy related with Ted Dabrowski from WirePoint, 737.
But first, into the newsroom we go. Here's the one and only Mike Scott.
7:31, 39 degrees. Skies are clear for now. Immigration and customs enforcement agents are, for now, being blocked from